We are only going to become more cross-cultural, more diverse, more, our communities will have more immigrants, more refugees, more people, and you need to take it upon, we as the church need to take it upon ourselves to be able to reach out and minister to those folks, even right here locally.
Welcome to Calvary Conversations. My name is Shaun LePage. I'm the chairman of the Ministry Studies Department at Calvary University. Thank you so much for joining us and for participating in this conversation. My guest today is actually one of my fellow Calvary Conversations hosts, Joshua Paxton. He's the director of the Burnham Center for Global Engagement. And he's also a professor of Intercultural Studies. And welcome, Josh. Glad to have you with us today.
It's good to be here, Shaun.
I'm excited about this conversation, and I want to start it by just congratulating you because, as our listeners may not know, you just recently completed a doctorate of education in intercultural education, and that's quite an achievement. So congratulations.
I'm just glad to have it done.
I'm sure.
The irony of getting a doctorate is you cross that finish line and you're not really done, because now people expect you to actually do something with
do more.
Yes.
You're expected to do more now, and
Yep.
to be brilliant and winsome and all kinds of stuff now. You're a doctor. So, but anyway, congratulations. It's a major achievement. I'm still working on my Doctor of Ministry, so I know what a great feeling that must be. You're also going to be launching a new program. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
So we're not really launching a new program. We're kind of transitioning a program we have. Calvary has had a Master's of Science in Education and there are varying emphasis areas in that degree program. One of them, Christian education, we realized that those who were in that particular program were missionaries. We're people serving on the mission field. And so with the chair of our education department, Dr. Mary Briggs, we're reframing that program into a Master's of Science in Education in Intercultural Education. And so that way we can zero in on areas of education and cross-cultural studies that will be more applicable to that area, those who are going to be teaching people of a different culture.
Excellent. So if anybody's interested in this, if that sounds like something that they would like to study, they can contact you and get all the details, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. Me, Dr. Mary Briggs, we're going to be hopefully launching that in the fall. So looking forward to having some students in there.
Good. Well, I wanted to talk with you today about this broader subject of intercultural education. Mm-hmm. And I personally have grown in my appreciation for this area of study, and I think that it's something that all Christians need to be engaged in.
Absolutely.
And I'll let you talk about that, but let's start by defining it. What is intercultural education?
So I'm going to give you a long, very involved definition, and then I will try to break that down for you. Okay.
That was a horrible way to start.
Yeah, it is a horrible. It is.
Don't tell us how long it's going to be. Just tell us how excited you are.
So obviously, though, if you're going to define something that would result in a master's degree, there's a lot to it. So okay. Right. And so I'm going to define it this way. This is the definition that I used in my dissertation. Intercultural education is the multi-dimensional process of relational interaction of beings and beings. Now that's capital B, beings, meaning God is involved in the educational process, and lowercase beings, meaning people, are involved in the educational process. It's multidimensional because education can involve lecturing, discussion. It's contextually dependent. It's not just academic in an academic setting, but it's also out in the world, learning, hands-on learning, getting experience. So there is a lot to it. But relational interaction of God, humans, the students, the educational community, and so the teacher, mentors, pastors, others who might be involved in that. We want to recognize that education is not something that just happens in the classroom, right? Education is a lifelong experience towards spiritual and intercultural development. Okay, so we want to develop people spiritually in their relationship with the Lord. We also want to develop their intercultural competency, if I will. I'll define that in a minute. And so there's two focus areas of intercultural education, two different ways that we could think about it. One of those ways would be across cultures. So that would be the example there would be of, if I as a teacher am going to go to Japan and teach in the Japanese school system, then I'm of one culture. I have one cultural background. My students have a different cultural background. And so how I teach them, all right, is going to need to take in a lot of considerations for crossing those cultural boundaries and communication. So that's one. The second is what we would call education for interculturality. Now that's a big long word. But essentially what that means is preparing students for crossing cultures. So that's the aspect of it where, for example, here at Calvary, I'm preparing students who are going to go out and serve on the mission field, or they're going to be the teachers. They're going to be involved in some kind of work or ministry that involves cross-cultural communication. And so in that sense, intercultural education is helping to prepare them for that role, stepping across cultures. So long definition, but I hope it explains that it's really that process of helping people to engage with others cross-culturally.
Why would teaching cross-culturally be different from teaching someone of the same culture? How is that different?
Okay. And so, it's good to point that out. Typically when we think of education, we think of the formal aspect of education, which is in a classroom with an instructor, right? But there's also, informal education, there's non-formal education, there's different kinds of education. And that plays into how we teach, the environment in which we teach. Something that we really want to stress is how important the context is to education. And so whether that's in a classroom, or it's, the pastor standing up and preaching on Sunday morning, or it's in a small group discussion time, or it's the mom at home homeschooling her kids, right? Those are all different contexts. And so how education is done within those contexts can look different. So of primary concern here is a cross-cultural context. And so there's, we have limited time. So just highlight a couple different things. Foundational to the entire discussion is obviously worldview differences. And so, we have a worldview. You and I share a worldview of Western Christian United States, that's Midwestern. We have very similar worldviews in that. But around the world, people's worldviews are not the same. And so their understanding of reality is not the same. The authority that they give to different areas of education. So consider perhaps within a worldview, your source of authority. For us, the Bible is a source of authority. For somebody of another culture, or even people within our own culture, the Bible is not a source of authority. And so how do you enter into and teach somebody when their source of authority, their basis for their worldview and their understanding of reality might be different than your own? And you've got to start at that level of understanding how to enter into their world and communicate things in a way that they understand. Ultimately, uh, intercultural education is really about that aspect of cross-cultural communication. That is, I have a message, whether that message is the gospel, or it's math or social studies or history, or whatever that message may be. I've got to be able to communicate that message in a way that this person's going to understand it. Because what matters is that they get the meaning of the message, right? When my presentation is irrelevant if they don't understand the meaning of what I am trying to convey. So from there, let me get into probably a primary thing, which is cognitive differences. We don't all think the same way. Because of our worldview, because of our culture, because of a myriad of factors, which take too long for this discussion. We just don't think the same way. We don't process information the same. We don't organize information the same. And then, of course, we have linguistic differences, but I want to highlight something in linguistic differences, which is not just the language. Obviously, language is a component of that. If you're going to communicate, if you're going to teach, you need to be able to do so in the language that your hearers will know and understand. That's basic. But our language also affects how we think and process information. Different cultures define terms differently, and those terms aren't necessarily equivalent across cultures. Like, your ministry chair of ministry studies, think of all of the time and energy that goes into understanding scripture and its historical and contextual context, the Greek, understanding the Greek terms. You're a pastor of a church, you want to exegete those things to your congregation so that they can understand them. The exact same thing is true when we go to teach somebody across cultural lines. I might understand what this word means. Meaning is a very important concept here. I might understand what this word means in English, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the meaning is the same, even when I directly translate it into another language, or that it creates the same image in that person's head when I translate it to them. So those are at least three areas.
Those are, I appreciate the things that you emphasize there, especially like that we don't all think the same. I think often that frustrates people if we're not, thinking clearly. We get frustrated, and I hear people say things like they don't think right, or they're stupid or whatever. But in reality, we don't all think the same, and that's not just um, a cultural difference, or I mean that can be true even in what we consider our own culture, that we don't all think the same
Absolutely.
way.
Absolutely.
And that's
So
yeah.
great example. So a great example of that. You have probably, I don't know if our audience has, but you have probably seen like the meme or the little video clip on Facebook of a girl making the statement, feelings are facts. Okay. And so this is something that is especially prevalent in our largely postmodern culture today, is that the way I feel about something determines the truth of that, whether it is a factual reality or not. Okay. But this is not new to postmoderns. This is not a new thing to postmoderns. This is actually a reflection of a intuitional thinking style. And so there are three main, as further illustrate the point, there are three main thinking styles. There's conceptual, concrete relational, and intuitional. And so the idea that our emotions, the way we feel about a situation, determines the truth, the veracity, the reality of that situation, is reflected in an intuitional thinking style, which is very much the thinking style of a lot of India, Nepal, kind of Asia, areas where the worldview is based in Hinduism and Buddhism. There is where Hinduism and Buddhism as religious beliefs basically say that all of reality is an illusion. And so as a result, it's not what's real that actually matters. It's what you feel about what's real. And so, Solomon writes, there is nothing new under the sun. Postmodernism is not new. The basic reality of that has been there for some time within this thinking style, which tells me that what matters is the way I feel about the situation, not the actual facts of the situation. So conceptual, Western thinking, the way we typically think and the way we, shove everything into an academic box, is very much in terms of concepts. So here at Calvary, if you come and you take a theology class, we're going to teach you systematic theology. Systematic theology reflects a conceptual thinking style. All those different branches, angelology, soteriology, ecclesiology, eschatology, those are all concepts. And so we understand the truth of Scripture in terms of a conceptual framework, right? Now, concrete relational, on the other hand, is understanding the concept in light of its practical, concrete reality. And so concrete relational is the thinking style of much of Africa, much of the Middle East. It's the thinking style that is reflected in the Gospels. If you actually want to kind of compare these two things, the Gospels reflect a concrete relational thinking style, was the thinking style of the Jews of the day, whereas Paul's letters reflect a more conceptual thinking style. It's one of the differences in those writings. And so concrete relational thinking style is more, well, I understand what this concept is because I can relate it to something directly. So Jesus is one of my best ways to explain this. Jesus taught in parables. Parables are a very concrete way of understanding a concept. So he would teach them, I don't have one right off the tip of my head here, but he would teach them eternal truths, concepts about heaven and hell, etc., by using stories, a concrete way of thinking about it. So the sheep and the goats, for example. The illustration of the sheep and the goats and separating the sheep and the goats is a very concrete way to think about the concept of what's going to happen in the end times between believers and unbelievers. Believers going to be with the shepherd and unbelievers going to the lake of fire. And so it's just a different way of presenting the information. But how we present the information is relevant for a person's ability to understand.
What you're saying actually kind of begs a question, and that is, how do we navigate these different ways of thinking without being judgmental about, because, and I think this is really relevant because, as you say, postmodernism in our time has really changed the rules, if you will, for different generations about how we get at the truth, or even whether we can get at the truth. So how do we navigate these different ways of thinking, without being judgmental and saying, well, that's a ridiculous way to, to try to come to the truth, and like you hear things like facts don't care about your feelings and whatever. How do we cross culturally navigate those different ways of thinking?
So the first thing that you should do is enroll in Calvary's Master of Science in Intercultural Education program.
I
And
see.
we will take a deep dive into that, because these are things which honestly you can't explain in 30 seconds. But let me start with maybe this one foundational premise, which is that, recognizing, okay, all of us are a bit ethnocentric. We
Right.
cannot help but be somewhat ethnocentric, because we have all been enculturated into our way of doing life, our understanding of how to think. We have been taught in an environment. You consider the person who goes to a public school system, and you go to the public school system, and within that school system you go through 12 grades, and the primary teaching style is lecture. You sit, you listen, you take notes, that is going to have an impact on how you think and process information. It's going to have an impact on how you approach people in authority. It's going to have an impact on the credibility that you give people in authority, right? It's going to have an impact on how you arrange information, the presentation of information. So, real quick illustration. Here in the West, we tend to think in outlines. Here's point A and point B and point C. And so when the pastor gets up to give a sermon, he's typically got, here's point A, or here's my first point, here's my second point, here's my third point, right? Here's my conclusion. Therefore, do this. But in Africa, for example, a typical way of presenting information would be exactly the opposite. Here's my support. Here's my main point, and here are my supporting points, which would be the Western way. We flip that on its head, and here's my supporting points, and here's my main point, and here's what you should do with it. And so you can think about the kind of problem that can result when the pastor gets up to preach and he's given his main point, and then he's going to come back around to it, okay? But he's in an audience where his audience thinks that his main point is actually the supporting point of one of his supporting points later on. He's not communicating. He's not effectively communicating because he's not organizing the presentation of his message in a way that the people of this culture can understand. So remember, probably most important point, remember, we're all a little bit ethnocentric, and we have to be able to develop the capability of stepping out of our ethnocentricity, our way of viewing things as being normal, to consider that just because somebody else, not talking about moral issues here, but just because somebody does something different doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong. That's not, obviously that's not related to moral issues. We have, there is a clear morality in Scripture, but just because somebody thinks or processes information differently than we do doesn't necessarily mean that their way of doing it is wrong. How do we enter into the way they think and present the information in a way that is understandable? I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think, it's the old adage of you can't just exegete the scriptures, but you also have to exegete the culture. You have to try, and that's really,
there's a quote that there is one of the things we would talk about would be learning styles. And so a common learning style for us would be lecture, often involving a lot of audio visual aids. But you consider perhaps an oral culture, a primarily oral culture. Can't get the word out. Where the way that they share information is dependent upon their ability to remember the information. And so giving a 3-hour lecture to somebody in an oral culture is not really going to help them remember anything. They need it in shorter bites. They need to be able to remember it. They need it presented in with mnemonic devices that help them to recall the information. And so there's no one size fits all way of presenting it. The truth is the truth. I mean, it's the truth. It doesn't change. It is what it is. But how we present the truth, all right, is dependent upon how they understand it. There's a cartoon that's related to standardized testing out there. And you got the teacher at the desk, and he's saying, okay, in order for everything to be equal, you will all take the same test. Please climb this tree behind me. And you have like a monkey and an elephant and a penguin and a fish, and it's like, what? It's idiotic. They can't all climb a tree. They just, I mean, a monkey, it's gonna really be able to climb that tree. A fish, forget about it. And it's there's this saying, if you judge an elephant by its ability to fly, it will live its whole life thinking itself a failure. And so how do we step into this culture's learning style, their way of understanding information, and present it in a way that is clear and makes sense to them? We're not changing the information. We're just presenting it in a way that they can correctly process it.
I think this is good, and I do think that to some extent it's instinctive. Um, we know that we can't explain something to a child in the same way that we would explain it to, say, our spouse or
Mm-hmm.
an adult friend or someone. And we also kind of instinctively know that when there's a cultural, I mean, when there's a language barrier, we slow down, we try to use words that we think are more common. And we kind of instinctively know that we have to be very careful with the communication process in order to communicate clearly. And
Sometimes, not to disagree with you, but I think sometimes we do and sometimes we don't, because again, that ethnocentrism comes into play, and dependent upon the degree of ethnocentrism that we have in our experience engaging with other cultures, it's all too easy to view, my normals should be the normals for everybody. um, and there is this attitude out there, right? My normal should be the normal for everybody. I am correct and everybody else is wrong. And so they need to adapt to me and my view of my normals, my way of doing things, rather than me adapting to them. But you get into an educational environment, especially, or you're a missionary on the mission field. You cannot expect, you're the one person who has now entered into their culture. You can't expect them to change for you. You need to figure out how to change in order to communicate this message, whether that message is math or it's the gospel, because you know the importance of this message. They don't.
yeah, I totally agree, and I think I probably should have said that sometimes we instinctively we instinctively do this, but at other times we fail to recognize the need for cross-cultural communication. Well, so we're out of time here, but take a minute or so and just boil it all down for us. Like, say, for the average Christian, or for a church, a local church leader or ministry leader, you know, um, why should we give our attention to our own intercultural education?
So I'll give two things. Number one would be the Great Commission. Matthew 28, Mark 16:15, Luke 24, John 20:21, Acts 1:8. I could throw in 2 Corinthians 5. I mean, I can spin verses all day long talking about the importance of sharing the gospel and reaching all peoples, panta ta ethne, all people groups, all family, ethno-linguistic family groups. And so it's important because there are people around the world who don't know the gospel. They don't know who Jesus is, and they are dying without that knowledge. And you cannot expect them to come your way in order to learn it. You can't expect them to learn English so that you can share the message of the gospel because you only speak English. They don't know the value of this message yet. And until they know the value of the message, why would they put forth that effort? They're not going to. You have to go to them. So we have to develop ways of communicating to reach them. But even more closer to home, right? Because we have people watching this. I'm never going to be in a cross-cultural situation. I'm never going to teach cross-culturally. Why is this even relevant to me? You may not be in one of those situations, but the reality of immigration and the ongoing refugee crisis is our culture, even right here in the United States, our communities are becoming more and more cross-cultural. This is not going to change. It's not, it's only going to become, we are only going to become more cross-cultural, more diverse, more, our communities will have more immigrants, more refugees, more people. And you need to take it upon, we as the church need to take it upon ourselves to be able to reach out and minister to those folks, even right here locally, right? We can't expect them to come to us. We have to go to them. They're not going to come to us to receive a message that they don't know is important. We've got to take it to them, even right here in our own context. And then even, I know I'm out of time, but even in consideration of cultural situations like we've seen over the past few years between whites and blacks, and those situations, okay? And I want to try to be very sensitive here, but oftentimes what lies at the bottom of those situations, the reality that lies under those situations, is cross-cultural differences in our understanding, in our interpretation of the facts of the events. All right, so here's the facts. These are the facts, but we don't all look at the facts through the same lens. We don't all think about the facts the same way because of our experience and our worldview. And if I can't enter into somebody else's understanding of the facts, why they interpret those facts differently, I'm never going to be able to enter into honest, life-building, life-affirming conversation with them.
Yeah, great. We have been given a great commission by Jesus, and that requires love and compassion, and in order to do that well, I think you're right that we must educate ourselves. We must be educated in those intercultural differences. Well, Josh, thank you so much for what you're doing at Calvary University.
Thank you, Shaun.
And thank you for this time and sharing with us about this really important issue as it relates to our walk with Christ, as well as Christian leadership. And those of you who have joined us for this conversation, thank you so much for your time. And as always, we encourage you to participate in the conversation. You can contact us through calvary.edu and look for the faculty page there, and you can contact Josh or myself or any of the Calvary faculty if you have questions about what we do here and about the conversations that we have here. So again, thank you for joining us for this. Grace and peace.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Calvary Conversations, a service of Calvary University in Kansas City, Missouri. We invite you to participate in the conversation by contacting us through the Calvary University website, calvary.edu, or by calling us at 816-322-0110. Join us again next week for another Calvary Conversation.